I want to start with a story of 1984 because it is directly relevant to making a comment in the spirit of this conference. In 1984, after a series of summer sessions sponsored by the China Film Association that loom large in my memory, I went to the head, when he was visiting here, of import-export for China films and said I had good news and bad news. The good news was that I've seen 8 movies that will play internationally, will win prizes at major film festivals, will help to establish Chinese cinema as a world cinema. They are films of enormous quality. They were films like one by a young director, Chen Kai-ga, who did Yellow Earth, that shot on a dirt floor studio down in Guilin with a cinematographer at the time, Zhang Yimou. That was the good news. You give me those films, I will tour America. The major cultural centers, the Museum of Modern Art will start in Los Angeles. The bad news is, it's none of the films you want to export. I was told by the then head of the Film Bureau that these films were not popular enough, were too avant-garde, were too controversial, and they weren't good films for the world to expand the knowledge and reputation of Chinese film. When I talked to the head of import-export, he said, good idea. We'll do it and we'll bring the directors to Los Angeles. A very brave, a very wise, and a very forward-thinking decision. Looking now, I have 5 minutes. I want to make 5 points that I think are relevant to looking forward in terms of Chinese film and its position in the world. The first of these is studio, and fantastic studios are important. Technologies are enormously important. Box office results are very gratifying and important. All of the elements of new theaters going up every day, important. But in the end, the single only important thing in the making of film and its future are the filmmakers. And it is the future of film rests with those who are now the young filmmakers, the future filmmakers. And that should be at the center, at the pivot of any discussion that takes place on strategizing the future. In my experience, teaching UCLA for 40 years or so, with many students who've gone on to win Oscars and Emmys and Golden Globes and Guild Awards, the single most important element was to develop students who are willing to take risks at the level of content, take risks at the level of style, take risks at the level of discourse, take risks that they might fail when they were students in what they were doing so they could succeed at a later point when they were serious filmmakers. And I think the same formula applies anywhere in the world. And in the many discussions I've had, and I'm not a specialist on Chinese film, for that I turn to the other Rosen on the panel, but I am a supporter of Chinese film on an international level and a friend to the filmmakers. And when I've gathered filmmakers together and said to them, what are the problems for creativity? They all said the same thing. The problems were the lack of transparency and caprice of censorship. There were the results that resulted in self-censorship, where you were afraid to take risks for fear of your future career. And the third was having an overstress on making money rather than advancing the art form. They were enthusiasts, they were people with a vision of the future, and they were people who were in some ways discouraged by the environment that they found. So that's point 1. Love your filmmakers. Point 2, in terms of the future that related back to the experience I had in the past, in figuring out the kind of films to be made, be Chinese. That we saw on these movies, these excellent films that we looked at, the power, for example, of the Chinese landscape, as powerful in its potential meaning as the Western landscape, Monument Valley was to the American Western, or the Outback to Australian filmmaking. Figure out ways to make that as compelling for the rest of the world. You have mythologies that transcend national boundaries and move into realm of the spiritual to be developed. There's daily life, not just past history, daily life. People wonder what's happening in China. They're aware of it. They want to know what young people are experiencing. They want to know the frustrations they have, and they want to know their aspirations for the future. So a second thing is, don't simply imitate American films, because a imitation of an American blockbuster done in China is an imitation of an American blockbuster. It is not the same thing. It doesn't have the same power. But there are things in the culture, there are things in the history to develop. Third point, closely related in that dialogue with the outside. Back in that period when, in the 80s, young filmmakers looked to international cinema. And the international cinema they looked to was the European avant-garde, the filmmakers like Antonioni and what have you. If now one is creating a dialogue, drawing on international cinema, draw on the best, not the worst. There's probably more to be gotten from the films that are edgy films like Inception that did very well at the Chinese box office than there is for yet still another American tentpole movie that's part of a franchise and playing out a formula. There's more to learn. I'm delighted that there are 14 films that have been added to the quota of 20, it's now what, 34, maybe 36 films, but they're all big blockbusters and 3D, what have you. How about 14 films selected from independent filmmakers at Sundance and Tribeca and what have you? They may not be great at the box office, but they may be very important to the dialogue across culture. Point 4, it has to do with the training of filmmakers, the relationship of theory and practice. In China, I encountered what I encountered in the United States. Here are the theorists here, developing the history and criticism. And here are the filmmakers. What I do, personally, is I teach theory to filmmakers. You want to expand their sense of the possible. You want them to have installed the software that enables them to think in more expansive ways about the possibility for storytelling and the elements of structure and style and discourse. The unity of theory and practice, and I talked about that in China often, how to bring back theoretical understanding into the training of movie professionals. Really a way to chart the future, to open possibilities. And finally, and it's not finally, but I have 5 minutes. The digital is your friend. The digital is the hope for the future. And the digital can be a seductress who will lead you onto the rocks. Okay. And on the one hand, the digital opens the possibility for a level of film literacy and practice that goes throughout the culture. And I saw that reflected in the 5,000 films that are at the independent film archive in China. It opens the way to a much larger pattern of visual literacy. The digital opens the way to amazing storytelling possibilities. The digital also, in movies where cows can fly, where you can put a different head on a different body, undermines the awe of human performance, and the performance becomes the movie itself, and no longer Charlie Chaplin on a tightrope with a monkey on his back, and you say, wow. So to explore the possibilities and the peril of the digital is something that ought to be on the agenda, and I must add something else as an archivist. If you think that you shot a movie that was born digital And because you put it on a hard drive and deposited it in an archive on the proper temperature and conditions of temperature and humidity, you have saved your movie. You're kidding yourself. The digital may be one of the first major cultural transformative events on a global scale for which there may be no historical memory. So be aware of preservation issues too. So, umpteen years later, after, I think that many of the lessons that I learned at the time from very smart people who are out there still apply right now. Thank you.